So, hi everyone, welcome. Thank you all so much for coming out here today. Can't hear. Okay, I'll be louder. Thank you all so much for coming out and joining us here today. My name is Netanel Crispe. I will be giving over this talk, and I hope all of you find it worthwhile and none of you are fleeing for the doors when it finishes. First off, just a few thanks. Thank you all, of course, for coming, and for everyone on Zoom for joining us here today. And special thanks, of course, to the Slate Valley Museum for giving me this platform and for helping setting this up and making this a reality. So quick few things about myself. My name is Netanel Crispe. I am 18 years old and I live in the small town of Danby, Vermont. I've always loved history, and as such, I am a trustee of the Mount Tabor Danby Historical Society. Gotta go, okay. I'm a trustee of the Mount Tabor Danby Historical Society, the Historic Preservation Program Coordinator for the Vermont Restoration Resource, and the Director of the East Poultney Jewish Cemetery Restoration Project. In addition to that, some kind of quick facts. I was born in Jerusalem, Israel. I'm a fully observant Hasidic Jew, and I'm a 10th generation Vermonter. So I kind of have history going all the way back. So now that I've kind of highlighted the things that made me popular in high school, I will kind of get into the presentation. So starting off, I'll have you all picture this, right? It's 1:30 a.m. You're feeling great. You just worked, you finished reviewing something you've been working on for a while. The last month you've been spending working on this presentation. You've done all your final edits, everything's coming out great, and you're looking over it, you're feeling good, you know? And you're ready to get in bed, wake up the next morning, and you'll be all set. Everything's looking great. So you finally finished with all this work. You go, you review the presentation, you're gonna give it over, and you realize it sucks. So unfortunately, that was me last night. So I had spent pretty much the last month coming up with this presentation, feeling really good about myself. And I realized giving it over for the first time that throughout the entire presentation, the key point that I was trying to press was that history is something valuable that we all have to learn from, we all have to appreciate. And really, I want to explore the reasons behind why it is, I think, especially people my age and my generation are kind of disillusioned by history, why we don't find it something of relevance, why most of my friends don't really care about it. They're more focused on the here and now, things like that. And really delve into the reasons behind why Vermont as an entire state was designated as endangered on a list by the National Registry of Endangered Places. And that's a pretty big accomplishment for an entire state to be listed, not just a town, but the whole state. So what the reasons behind that are and what factors kind of contribute to that, as well as how can we combat this? What is it we can do to really make history fun, interesting to the masses, and really have a resurgence of, or a historic revival in a sense. And while I was talking about this throughout my entire presentation, I realized I was doing the very things, I was giving over a presentation in the very way that I always found boring when it was shared with me. So the key things going kind of through high school and middle school, when history is communicated to adolescents, especially, we see it as something that you're in a classroom environment, you're given a textbook that you read, and there's facts and dates and all these things that really you don't see much relevance with. And yet when I was giving over this presentation, I have to say, I always hated that because I understand how that makes history appear boring. And yet when I was giving over this presentation, I was doing exactly what I was talking about not doing. So I realized I had to kind of give it up and come up with something new. So as any rational individual would do, late last night, I stayed up till 5 a.m., kind of kicking myself, finally cried myself to sleep, and woke up here today to present this with you. Now, I was really, the entire morning and everything else, I was thinking of ways that I can make this presentation fun and try to communicate with all of you why it is I personally love history and why it is history is so influential and so valuable to us in the here and now, and is really the foundation upon which everything we have is built and everything that we will create is going to be built. And so in doing that, I spoke to my father and kind of got some ideas. And really what it came down to was stories. One of the things that really works, and we learned this through psychology, on how to relate with people and what sticks when somebody hears a lecture or something else, is when it's personal, when it's something interesting, it has ups and downs. It's kind of like a narrative. Any good book, any good movie has these same kind of qualities, where you can be a part of the adventure, that you can really live and feel like you know the characters involved and can envision the scene being described. So history in and of itself really is just a collection of stories. And as such, I want to give over kind of my story here today, and hopefully do it in a way that, again, you will all enjoy and can relate to, and hopefully will be as real as it can. So jumping right in, like I said, I'm 18 years old. I was born in Jerusalem. Kind of moving from there, my family and I moved to Florida, and then from there to Philadelphia, where I lived most of my life, 9 years. And then about 7 years ago, we moved to the small and beautiful town of Danby, Vermont. As I also mentioned, my father's a native Vermonter. He was born in Brattleboro and born and raised in Brattleboro, Vermont. And on his side of the family, I'm a 10th generation Vermonter. So kind of one of the reasons why it is, again, answering this big question, why does history matter and why do I love it? Why is it something that has driven all the work that I've done over these years? And why, as a kid, was I more interested in going out metal detecting than playing sports or hanging out with friends? So it really comes down to two main factors, I would say. In the same way that in biology and again in psychology, we explore the nature versus nurture argument, we see in anything that's shown with us on how it is we become the people we are today, that there's a multitude of factors that influence the way we grow up and how we change and evolve. And a lot of that, again, nature perhaps, in the sense that maybe I'm just inclined more than others with history. I enjoy it more. I don't know. That's biological. But I think really the main key factor is in nurture and what's influencing how you live your life and everything else, and what factors are involved in that. So growing up, as I mentioned, I've lived in these four main places, all of which, of course, have extremely rich histories, Jerusalem being thousands of years old, with Israel, Florida being one of the earliest settlements, European settlements in North America, and Philadelphia, first capital of the United States, and then Vermont, which I personally think is the best of them all, and has its own incredibly rich history, which I will explore more today. So within those factors, growing up, I was always surrounded by these key things that really mattered, such as my synagogue in Philadelphia was from 1704. Right next door was a Quaker meeting house from the 1600s. And next door to that was John Dickinson's house, one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. And all of this was always there in my life. And growing up as a kid, I really didn't understand what it was. I took a lot of it for granted. And even though I had an appreciation for history, it hadn't made its relevance clear to me before, right? And especially I think a lot of this was due to, again, how it was communicated in the classroom environment, that every time I learned about it in a school or in an educational sense, it was always something foreign. It was an other. It was something that had its time, it had come, it had done its thing, but really didn't matter in the here and now. And I fear that that's something that when you explore and search for the root cause of why it is most adolescents don't value history, it's tied into that, right? That they see it as something that's not relevant. And yet, even with all this happening, history was all around me and I just didn't see it, right? So once I finally we made our way to Vermont, something my family and I had been hoping to do for many years, we finally found, our dream house in, again, the small rural town of Danby, Vermont, a 1795 colonial, which was amazing, colonial farmhouse. We made our move about 7 years ago, and this is really when I opened up my eyes and I started exploring the potential and exploring the vast and incredible world that is history. So unlike when I was in Philadelphia and all these things, keep in mind, when I was in Philly, I thought I was going to be a math whiz. I'm not. And that was kind of my goal. But once I came to Vermont, I started realizing that history isn't just what it's shown in the textbooks, that it's not only these key figures, key events that you hear about, that you see markers for, or that are described, but really that history can be found and is in every single thing that is around us, right? From the big maple trees that line the roads or the stone walls in the fields, the old barns or houses, all of these contain their own stories, their own narratives, and their own unique legacies that they pass on, right? And it's the same with people, that we all have something to contribute, and that all of us live our own unique lives, face our own hardships, overcome our own hardships, and have our own failures and triumphs, successes and achievements that should be preserved and deserve to be remembered and shared. So kind of working off of that, my sister, when I was applying to college, came up with a great essay topic, which was, it was basically I could write about whatever I wanted. And the key point was her quote, which is that one of kind of humans' greatest fears is of being forgotten, right? And something we see in psychology again, and it's something that we live with, that we don't want our lives to seem meaningless. We want to know that all that we went through matters, right? To someone or something, that we did something in our lives that has meaning. And that's true with every single person, of course, and we know that. But yet, when we look at history and we look at cemeteries and buildings and stories, so many people are really just thrown under the rug. Their stories are forgotten, and it's unfortunate. It's not deserving, and kind of going based on that cliche of when you're younger and you hear treat others how you want to be treated yourself. It's the same reality, that all of us will eventually have our time, right? And we want to be treated better than we're treating these other people. So tying into that, seeing this relevance and recognizing how important it is and how meaningful it must be to preserve and explore history. We moved to Vermont, and I kind of took those values with me, and were able to understand them further. And within our first year, again, this is a Hasidic family. For those, that's an Orthodox Jewish family in Vermont. There's very few. And we moved to the middle of nowhere. And yet within the first few months of moving here, we hear of a presentation at the local historical society, which similar to the one we hear today. And it was by Mrs. Bower, Ellen Bower. And she was giving over history, which was, I'm going to paraphrase, I don't remember the exact title, but Abe Rosen and the Jews of Danby. And we were like, whoa, what are the chances that in the middle of nowhere there are Jews here? And we go to this presentation, we learn about this entire Jewish history that dates back to the early 1900s and even the late 1800s. And I was blown away. And I couldn't believe that we were not the first people here. It really seemed like something guided us to this specific town and how we ended up coming to be here. So again, the inspiration from that just took off. I met the president of the Historical Society, Bradley Bender. I asked to join, and I'm a 12-year-old kid, but I wanted to be a part of this. I didn't really know what it entailed. And I showed up to the first meeting they had, and I realized I was, to say the least, the youngest person there by about 60 years. I kind of sat in the corner quietly, just biding my time, listening, and but not really participating, because these were all people so much older. I didn't think it was my right to interrupt at any point. And I sat through this entire thing, and I'm hearing all these incredible different pieces and stories from the town. And eventually I built up the nerve to ask the question about my house. Did anybody know the history of the people who built that, or the people that lived in my house? And remarkably, they did. They had so much to share. I was blown away, right? And this is a place that, unlike a lot of those other buildings or those other things that you come in contact with, we living in such a historic place in Vermont and New England, New York, all these areas are surrounded by so many surviving kind of pieces of the past, right? And although so many are lost, we still, thank God, unfortunately, live in a time where there's a lot still to preserve. And yet, if we don't do it, it will be lost forever. So once you live in a place like this and be able to interact with it, it's kind of like going to an old school or anything like that in your daily life, that the floors I'm standing on, being able to live in this house, are hand-hewn boards, and that if you go in the basement, you look up and there's original tree logs with bark on them from the 1700s, and all these incredible qualities which bring these houses to life and these structures. And it really, again, inspired me to want to know more. I wanted to know who these people were, how it was they created something that survived 230 years or so, and why that's important and meaningful. Who were they, right? So about a year later, my sister had a friend over. Her dad was picking her up from a sleepover, and he noticed it was an old house, and he did metal detecting, which I never really knew much about. And he basically asked if he could metal detect the property, and even based on my giddy interest, was willing to take my father and I out to explore as well. And the excitement of being able to do this, to see, and people never realize how much is buried kind of right under the surface. And I kind of like to use that metaphor with anything, that there's always the potential that lies beneath, right? And being able to see this and really bring that to life was amazing. So we go out metal detecting, and in hindsight, what we found may have not been the most interesting, but to me, it really was. And he finds two what are called dandy buttons, big colonial coat buttons in the front yard. And I'm blown away. These are buttons that were most likely worn and owned by the guy who built our house, right? And I was like, whoa, these are the coolest things ever, right? And he even gave them to us, and they now sit on display in the Historical Society. It was amazing for me. So that got me kind of hooked, and I began pursuing the hobby further. My best friend, Soren Erickson, whose parents are here with us today, he joined me, and we kind of went off from 7th grade all the way through and are still doing it to this day. And through that hobby, we've been able to uncover and unearth, as well as preserve, thousands of artifacts and relics that each help paint, kind of add color to the mosaic that is our collective memory, right? They all added their own pieces. All of them are unique in their own right and have their own stories to tell. And all of these kind of range going through, and I can show, I don't know if we have on the slideshow, I don't know how to show that. But these kind of range from simple things like household items, which I brought a bunch with me here to show today, like spoons and buttons and buckles, things that have their own personal stories that help tie into the people who lived there and who held them and things like that, as well as things of more of a kind of national historical value rather than just local. So over the last 4 years, one of the amazing things that I've been able to uncover, and something that really is incredible in the sense that anybody can do this. It's not like you have to be an archaeologist or something. This is available to everyone. Was through metal detecting. Growing up, I always loved watching the National Treasure movies. I don't know if anybody's heard or seen them, but there's a reference in the movie to George Washington inaugural buttons. And I actually wrote one of my college essays on this. And in the movie, they basically use it. They get like a fingerprint to break into the National Archives and steal the Declaration of Independence using these buttons. That's not my plan, but they're really quite exceptional pieces. So I learned about these when I was a wee little lad, and it's been quite amazing since. So never did I imagine, though, watching those movies growing up, that about 5-6 years later, I would actually be unearthing that very same relic, metal detecting, across the state of Vermont and New York. And to this day, I'm actually now up to 4. And I'm one of probably a handful of people in the world who can say that, because these buttons, their history is remarkable. I have some pictures of them, and I actually brought them with me here today to show you all. These are buttons from 1789 that were made for George Washington's first presidential inauguration. And were at New York when he became president, which is incredible. These were there and got to see that, that history coming to life, right? So it's with things like that that we really get to interact on a personal level with the past, right? Again, as I mentioned before, a lot of the disillusionment comes from the fact that most people see history as an other. They see it as irrelevant. They don't get to interact with it. But this is something I get to hold a button that was probably lost 250 years ago, 230 years ago, and has been sitting in the ground since then. And I'm the first person to touch it. It's like archaeology, right? It's time travel, to be able to experience that and interact with these on that level. And then to take that even further, though, these relics and artifacts are amazing in their own right, as I mentioned, and have their own incredible stories. But when you can connect that to individuals and use that in relation to old maps or documents or histories, they become all the more meaningful. So through my metal detecting, and over the last 6 or so years, I've done this again. I've been doing it on behalf of different historical societies and museums across the state of Vermont. I've donated almost all of my finds to them, in an effort of really making sure that this history isn't only available to me, but is available to the masses and anybody who wishes to explore it or learn more about it, which has been incredibly enriching. And one of the amazing things that has allowed me to do is over the last 6 years, I've worked to locate and document the first 10 settler homes in the town of Danby, all of which have been lost for about 150 years, many of which are now cellar holes, and most of which are completely no signs. They're in what are now farm fields. There's nothing to use really from the naked eye to determine that this was a home site or that there was a cabin here in 1765. And using a variety of different sources, maps, accounts, records, as well as metal detecting, I was able to find these and then actually find things from them, which is amazing. I brought a lot of this with me here today. And these are coins, these are buttons that were owned by the people who in the 1760s, 1765, and 1767 made their way to what was then the absolute wilderness, no European life here, and found their ways by marked trees and basically cleared land, built log cabins, endured harsh winters, and overcame the greatest obstacles. And I think beyond anything, when we look at, again, the relevance and how this translates into our everyday lives and the here and now, we see that these are people who endured hardships that most of us can never imagine, right? We struggle, we have our own struggles, of course, which are all valid, and we all face our own obstacles. But when we can see that other people did this and they overcame this and they flourished as a result of it, and we're able to create something such as a town that has eventually led up to thousands of people living there and has its own incredible history, they were able to do this in a time, again, when they were alone. So the inspiration that leads to is really amazing. So kind of going on from the metal detecting tract, again, this all ties into one another. As I mentioned, a lot of these buildings are in danger of being destroyed and fall down. And unfortunately, every year we lose hundreds, if not thousands, of historic structures across probably New England and thousands more across the rest of the United States. And a lot of this is due to the fact that simply people don't care. There's a lot of factors that, of course, tie into that, but it's really neglect and just a loss of appreciation for the past. So in connection with that, growing up, I want to be the guy who like saved that old home at the end of the road. And I want to do this when I was probably 6. I want to do it when I was 8 and 10 and everything else. And by the age of 14, I finally, tried to actually do that. And there's a home in the town of Rupert, Vermont, which is about 30 minutes from here. And it was built in 1770, and I was like, this is the place I'm going to save. I'm 14 years old. Who cares? I'm going to do it. So just picture for a moment a 14-year-old kid calling the town clerk and a realtor and saying, I want to view this house and I want to restore it, even though I have no money and it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. But that was me, and I did it. So I met with the realtor. We explored the property, and I did some research in the clerk's office. And eventually, though, I kind of backed down. I realized, one, I was afraid of the work involved because I was going into high school and this was a lot. And two, I was kind of disillusioned and in fear of the possibility of failure, right? And this was recognizing where I was in my strengths, and maybe I took on a project of a bit too large of a magnitude. But moving on to 16, I tried something like this again in the town of, and there's pictures on the slideshow, which again, I can go through. In the town of Wallingford, Vermont, there was a house that was listed as having been built in 1765, which is incredibly old for Vermont. And I was like, whoa, this has to be preserved. This has to be one of the oldest houses in the state. This is incredible. So I pursued it even further. I went and I basically spent, like any normal teenager, every other day after high school in the town clerk's office and historical society, digging through old records and speaking with different local historians, to uncover kind of the history and the story of this amazing house, right? And eventually we came up and were able to recreate this lost narrative and discovered that the house actually wasn't built in 1765, but was in fact built in 1783 by the son of a Revolutionary War captain, and who was also a captain in the local militia himself, and that the house had this incredibly rich history in relation to the War of 1812 and the American Revolution and Tories and all these other amazing things. And unfortunately, it was just sitting here and I was going to be demolished. And so I pursued this further. I tried to raise funds. I spoke to a few people, and yet again, I backed down. And thank God this house still stands, just barely. It's pretty much been condemned and will probably be demolished soon. And so that's one of those, again, these sad realities that we face. However, that doesn't mean you can't do something. So in an effort to form a platform in which, again, not doing this alone, which is something that a lot of people don't realize, in what every individual, just on a day-to-day basis, what the small things that we can do, which have extremely impactful significance, is not working alone, not seeing one of these projects as you're in it alone, you have to do this yourself, but using the community around you and really exploring the tools that are at your fingertips. So at about 16, I helped co-found the Vermont Restoration Resource, which is a nonprofit that does historical restoration amongst other things. And through that, we were able to do a lot of smaller projects across the state of Vermont. And that was really the platform that I was going to use to make this project a reality. And again, though, unfortunately, when you're looking at $500,000, it's a bit difficult. But that all led up to the project that I'm really here today to speak about, which is the East Poultney Jewish Cemetery project. So this is where I bring all these different weird interests and hobbies that make me a nerd together, and kind of retelling the story. So last year, in the summer of last year, I was doing metal detecting in Poultney, primarily in East Poultney, Vermont. And I got permission to what's known as the Pine Tree House. A very nice family was there, and they gave me permission to metal detect the property. The house was built in the late 1700s and has its own incredible history, with Heber Allen, one of the brothers of Ethan Allen, living right next to it. And I think one of the first ministers in town having owned the house and occupied it. But what was really significant is when they told me that the house was actually used, noticing my yarmulke and tzitzis and recognizing that I was Jewish, that the house was actually used as a Jewish synagogue. And here's me, again, having lived in Vermont for 6 years, had no idea this history existed. What are the chances, right? So I asked them further and try to learn as much as I can, and they give over the brief history that they know, and tell me, as well as some other local families in the town, including some that are here with us today, that there's actually a Jewish cemetery up at the end of the road. And again, I'm astounded. Like, what are the chances, right? So when you normally hear about Jewish cemeteries in a place like Vermont, what I, from my personal experience, expect is that you will find within a larger cemetery a kind of small lot that has a few Jewish headstones. That's been kind of sanctioned off, but never an actual cemetery in and of itself. Because again, Jews, we don't have a long history in Vermont, and there, as far as I understood prior to this point, there wasn't really a large community up until you got to Rutland and what you see in Burlington, the late 1800s. And yet, once I finally found the cemetery, which was completely overgrown and so non-visible from the road, it took me 3 times to find. And once I finally did find it, I was blown away. Here was a full-blown cemetery with roughly 80 headstones in it, all with Hebrew inscriptions and Stars of David and all these fascinating things that was just kind of hidden away in the middle of nowhere in Poultney, Vermont. Like, what are the chances, right? And as much as I was excited to find this and to be able to learn about it, I was also really kind of disappointed to see that so many of these headstones had fallen into disrepair, that a lot of them were broken, lying in the dirt, illegible, completely worn, covered in moss and other things, and that the cemetery itself, as I mentioned, you couldn't really find. It was completely overgrown, and not due to a lot, like just a hatred or anything of that nature, but rather that people have to recognize when history isn't appreciated to this extent, there's very few funds available to places like towns to invest in preserving it. So when you have a town that has to maintain half a dozen cemeteries, if not more, with thousands and thousands of headstones, and they have a very minimal annual budget, they can't really do much more than mow the lawns. And that, unfortunately, was the case here. So immediately I began an effort to understand and learn more about the history of this amazing site. And in doing so, I came across an article written by Professor Shine at Middlebury College, Director of Jewish Studies there, that gave over, and I actually have a copy of it here with me today. It's an article within this book, gives over basically a recounting of the Jewish history of Poultney, and talks about the Poultney Pinchas, which is basically a Jewish book. Pinchas is like a minutes book that has kind of transcribes the key events of any meeting or events, things like that. And this Pinchas, which dates from 1867 to 1891, was recovered in Denver, Colorado in the mid 20th century. And basically made its way to New York, and he eventually discovered it. And it turns out to be the oldest record of formal kind of community Jewish life in the state of Vermont that we have. And it describes, and I have some pictures of it on the presentation. I have some with me here today. Goes all the way through the founding of this Jewish community, a Jewish congregation in 1867 in East Poultney, Vermont, called the Israelite Assembly, and basically their whole history and how they grew and what they ended up doing, eventually leading to their disbandment in the early kind of turn of the century, early 1900s. And I was blown away. So the most significant thing about this was not only was this a document that talked about the Poultney Jewish community being the oldest in the state of Vermont that we know of, that's formed, right? Oldest congregation, but that they also had a synagogue, as mentioned in this house, and that they had a cemetery, and that this cemetery was the oldest Jewish cemetery in the entire state, right? What are the chances of finding that with any group to say this is the oldest, and that nobody knew about it? So a lot of people in the community hadn't even heard about it. Even some neighbors didn't know that was right next door, which was mind-blowing to me. But I was like, wow, if this is really the oldest, something's got to be done. We got to do something. So again, I'm 17 years old, going into my my senior year of high school, and a lot of stuff going on, college applications, midterms, everything else. And yet I was like, I'm going to do this project. Who cares? I'm only doing a million things. We can make this one as well. And I basically started exploring, and I spoke with the town and the historical society, each of which have been incredible helps, and started a GoFundMe and basically started researching this more to raise funds to restore the cemetery. I never in my wildest dreams would I have thought that within a couple of months, the project would be in over 80 newspapers around the world, including the Washington Times and Israel Times and Jerusalem Post, and all these big newspapers, as well as locals around the country and even internationally in France and Israel and a few other places. And that this story would be so well known, and that more so than just getting the story out and preserving, again, making people know about this place and getting it the recognition it deserves, seeing that the history of these people are really being preserved and appreciated, but that so many people wanted to be a part of this project. So in total, as of today, I think we've gained donations from over 300 people around the world, Jewish, non-Jewish, of every creed and background. Over the past year, we've been able to raise over $19,000 for the project. Again, this is basically through GoFundMe and a lot of other people fundraising for us, including advertisement from places like the Slate Valley Museum, who just wanted to help out. And in addition to that, through volunteering efforts and everything else, we've had a total of around 80 different people, some of which drove all the way from like Virginia and New Jersey and other places to be a part of this project. And it blew my mind away, right? So all of this came together to, over the past year during COVID, we were restricted in amounts of people and things like that, works that we could do, especially during the winter. But we were able to clear out the entire, kind of clear off the fence line, get rid of all the brush. We took out probably 20, 30 truckloads worth of brush from the cemetery, and really open it up again so that it can both be viewed from the inside and out, which is amazing. And that in addition to that, basically on the 6th of June, on the anniversary of D-Day, we went in, me and about 25 volunteers and experts went into the cemetery and fully reset and repaired every single headstone in this cemetery. And to be able to look back and see these comparisons of how the stones look before and how they look now was amazing, and one of the most fulfilling things I've ever done in my life, to see how beautiful they've all turned out, and to really be able to, again, these are people who, many of their families are no longer in the state. Many of their families, even more surprisingly, have reached out, and we even have descendants with us here today and contributed to the project and were invested in it and participated and everything else. And to finally see that these people are getting, again, the recognition they deserve, that they have not, they're no longer being forgotten, and they're getting the respect, because these people really were pioneers in their own sense. They were some of the first Jews in the state of Vermont to, again, establish any kind of formal community. And they did this against all obstacles. This is just post the Civil War. And they're doing this at kind of height of anti-Semitism. They're in the middle of nowhere. So in terms of keeping Jewish observances such as holidays or kosher or anything of that nature would have been extremely difficult. And yes, they did it. And they formed their first synagogue, and we have records through this Pinchas of them purchasing the Torah scrolls and these different things for religious ceremonies and everything of that nature, which is amazing to see, especially the prices of them. It was like $1 for things that now cost like $100,000, and everything else, of course, inflation. But to see that they were able to not only live here, but that they really thrived as a community, and then to understand the immense will, devotion, and kind of faith that they must have had to be able to overcome all these obstacles and to really flourish in such a remote part of the world. And it's really incredible, and especially coming here, again, me being one of the only religious Jews or Hasidic Jews in the state of Vermont, and feeling, again, I love it. I have no issue with it, but it's definitely difficult when you can't get kosher food pretty much anywhere and there's not really much around you. To see, though, that I wasn't the first, that other people did this and did this well. And that was like really the greatest inspiration. And again, translates and sees or highlights how this stuff translates across time, that the lessons that are being that were learned from people 100, 200, 1,000 years ago still impact the way that we act today. And that if we learn from these things, both the good and the bad, we can really create a brighter future moving forward. And unfortunately, especially looking at where we stand today, in recent years, more than perhaps ever before, we've seen how, or the dangers of not learning from the past, especially you see that with COVID-19, how things that seem to be of such a kind of antiquated nature we're able to break down all the governments of the world in a single act when we live in what we feel is one of the most, or is the most technologically advanced age. And we feel so superior to how we were back then. And yet simple things that plagued us then continue to plague us now. So it's really learning from the past to inspire the future. And one of the great things, a lot of people like to quote the American Spanish philosopher, George Santayana, who says, who famously stated that those who fail to remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And I like to kind of reform that quote into those who fail to remember the past are bound to lose it. So it's not something, because when you look at it just with that negative connotation that the past, everything that repeats itself is bad, you start seeing history as just an account of failures. And at the same time, we can't whitewash history in the sense that we only focus on our successes. We have to explore both the good and the bad, because both come with their own crucial lessons that help us in the day that, and help us now and in the future. So finalizing off with the Jewish Cemetery Project, as I mentioned, we've now raised over $19,000. It got all this international media attention. The project is going great. As I said, the main key point was to restore the headstones, which has pretty much been done. There's a few that still need a bit of work. But because of the incredible funds that we were able to raise, we are, in addition to doing the headstone restoration, I'm also going to be digitizing every headstone and adding as much information through genealogies and research like that we can find, and probably find a grave. We're going to eventually replace the fence line with a new fence that looks nice, because the one there is pretty much dilapidated. And we currently have commissioned for a local blacksmith, to make a new gate, because the one there is broken. A wrought iron, simple but beautiful gate that reads East Poultney Hebrew Cemetery, which was the historic name of it, as well as are getting a state historic marker to be placed at the site. So all of this ties together and is really amazing for the work that can be done. So the main kind of key point that I would highlight with that is that, again, I did this at 17. I'm not the only one who can do this, and people younger than me, older than me, everybody is able to have a similar impact. And that really none of this would have been possible if it wasn't for all the different, excuse me, all the different community members and everyone else who contributed to this effort and made this a reality. So really, when asked the question kind of, why is history meaningful? Why should people my age be invested in history? Why should we care? Not only focusing on, again, those kind of cliches that if you don't learn from it, it's going to repeat itself, or that history is the foundation of what we have, blah, 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 which I know I've repeated today because I think it's true. We really got to focus on the fact that history has to be shown or taught or communicated in a way where you can interact with it on a personal level, because that's kind of what I'm trying to do here today. I don't know if I'm doing a good job, but I'm trying. And seeing, again, through these different pursuits that they're all available to us. Metal detecting, historical reenacting, museums, everything like this is a different piece to that puzzle. Each help kind of add color to the painting, and each are equally important. So there's so much that we can do as individuals to really change the way that the broader community explores and kind of thinks of the past and sees it as something not of just the past, but as something of the present and the future. So I've spoken for a while. I don't know if I'm doing a good job, but I will, if that's all good, open it up for questions. So thank you all so much. Yeah, go ahead. So that's, yeah, so the question was asked, and the height, what was the Jewish population of the town of Poultney? That's something I can't give it an exact estimate for. What I can say is that really, if you trace back through the evolution of the community, you see two big migrations, one in kind of the mid to pre to during Civil War period of Jews coming mostly from kind of East Germany, and then a later mass migration coming from Eastern Europe. And that's kind of the two main groups. So Poultney itself, you had Jews kind of spread out throughout the slave industry. They mostly came as peddlers and things of that nature. None of them were like these. A lot of the time were poor peddlers from Europe, Eastern Europe, and they came to Poultney in the Slate Valley and really used their skills in this much the same way. So rather than working in the quarries or owning a quarry or something of that nature, they were generally the providers of goods and services. So they had stores and groceries and basically continued their trades in the same ways. And once that community was established in 1867, really done by a group of these local Jews who wanted to bring back the same, continue and carry on their traditions from Europe, wanted to still be able to have Jewish and religious observances, they started this community. And once they did, kind of all the Jews in the surrounding areas came to them, and that's when you see the second migration and an increase. So the history and span of that, you see smaller in the like 1860s to 1850s, communities founded late 1860s. In 1873, the cemetery is purchased by the Jewish community, and we actually have the exact record where it says that. In 1874, the first person's buried there, Marcus or Mordecai Kane. It's the oldest stone in the cemetery, which actually went down this fall while we were starting the restoration, which highlighted that, again, this wasn't just every few years the stone went down, but at any point in time, they could fall over, and really reminded me of how important it was to do this here and now. So that's kind of where it goes on. And then the cemetery continued to be used throughout the 1800s, and some of the most recent stones even go into the 2000s. But the community really disbanded around the turn of the century, after its height being probably the 1880s, 1890s, when East Poultney kind of dwindles in its significance, and Poultney becomes the new hub of economic and industrial life, as well as Rutland taking over. Again, a lot of this relates to the railroad and the fall of the slave industry, things of that nature. So that's when you see many of the Jews, or most of the Jews in the Poultney area, kind of heading or migrating to Rutland, some to other parts of Vermont, some out west, and some to New York City, to other places where they can continue on. And that's when you also see kind of the founding of the Rutland Jewish community and synagogue and the cemetery in Clarendon, as well as a bit before that, and during that same time, the one in Burlington. So we don't know exact estimates, but probably I think it would be safe to say as many as 30 families at the height, maybe a bit more. Again, it's kind of speculation, not knowing specifically. Yeah. Yes, so the question was, in relation to my own family history, is there kind of a story behind that as to why my parents went to Jerusalem, and how that ties into my father being a ninth generation Vermonter and the history? What's the story behind that itself? So there definitely is. I'll give that over very briefly. So as I mentioned, my father was a ninth generation Vermonter on his grandmother's side. I'm a 10th generation Vermonter, and growing up, one of the, again, these things that inspired me into history was going to my great grandmother's house, and which is a colonial house in Newfane, Vermont, and having a great grandmother who's 98. My great grandfather was at Omaha. He served in World War II, and hearing their stories and being surrounded by kind of their antiques and everything else, going to old bookstores, antique stores, everything like that really inspired me. and is around all of us. So in relation to, that's kind of my father's side. My father's family on his grandmother's side goes all the way back to the Mayflower. They've been in Vermont since the 1760s, and prior to that, the Mayflower. And on his grandfather's side, we're all Italian. His grandfather served in World War II. And then on my mother's side, though, my mother was, or I should highlight, my father is a convert. His family is Christian, not religious, but Christian, and converted to Judaism in his early 20s. My mother was raised Jewish, but not as religious. And basically, they became Orthodox, and then once married, moved to Jerusalem, where me and my sisters were all born. So the story of that kind of goes that way. And my mother's family history on the Jewish side goes all the way back. We can trace it back to Moses, which is kind of cool. So all through. So that's its own story, and for another time. But yeah, youth hope. So the question was, wouldn't somebody who had some kind of relative in the cemetery, and correct me if I'm not restating this properly, but have come in prior to my work and done some kind of restoration or been more involved? Why did it take so long for this to happen? So my response to that would be kind of two things. In the same way that you see with these houses that I mentioned that I want to restore, you can see pictures of these homes 10 years before, and they're totally habitable. People are living in them. They look beautiful. Within a 10-year span, they went from that to falling into the ground. So with anything old, disrepair leads to kind of falling down really fast, for language terms. But so the same thing kind of happened with the cemetery, where I know certain people who saw it 30 years ago and it looked a lot better. And you did see actually what you're saying, probably around the 60s or so, it seems that somebody went in who had a few $1,000s and did do a restoration. Unfortunately, they had very minimal funds and didn't really know what they were doing. So they put concrete into all the foundations to basically put all the stones back up, which probably looked great for 15 years. But now once they've fallen over again, we have huge slabs of concrete stuck to the stones, which was a bit annoying. But you did have people who cared. So the cemetery basically became abandoned around the 60s or so. And you do have people who were buried 50s, 40s and stuff, but fewer. And once it became abandoned in, I think, the early 70s, one of the descendants of a family buried there reached out to the town and basically offered them a few $1,000s to have a fund to take over the cemetery as technically an abandoned cemetery and basically maintain it as such as a town cemetery. And that's what happened. Unfortunately, a few $1,000s over 60 years doesn't really go far, especially when you're only using interest on that. So there was work done in the past. People have come in, and you can see in the cemetery, there's certain stones that look absolutely beautiful. And a lot of that's generally tied into the families who still have living descendants or descendants in the local area. Unfortunately, those are generally families, as you'll see also with the Granville history, such as the Rosens, the Bergers, the Fernandez, who all of which have been incredible contributors to the project. And they came generally in the later 1800s, 1880s. Most of the founding families, such as the Canes and the, spacing on the other names of the nature, those founding families, as far as I know, none of their descendants are in the area, and most of which, if they have, don't even know the cemetery probably exists. So those are the stones that really fell into disrepair, and those are the oldest ones in the cemetery. Yes. Yeah, so the gentleman asked what, if I know, generally speaking, what the Jewish population of the state of Vermont is today. I can say about a year ago I did. I don't want to be incorrect with this. There's two kind of sources. I think one of them is that it's roughly, again, the state of Vermont's about 620, 30,000 people. That the Jewish population, I think the estimate was, I want to say 20,000, maybe it was 10 to 20,000. But at the same time, that's only taking into account the people who recognize or identify as Jewish. So then you have two different factors. You also have many Jews, which you see around the world, especially in relation to the Holocaust and other things, who don't know that that they have Jewish kind of ancestry. So in that sense, if you took all of those into account, or anybody who has some kind of Jewish relation, it could be as many as 50,000 for all we know. So I think officially though, if you search it, I want to say it's within that range of 10 to 20. I could be incorrect. Of those though, the religious Jewish population of Vermont is very, very minimal. So yeah, if I could share the slides and kind of give you guys pictures of the things I've been talking about. And again, I hope this wasn't a complete flunk. Thank you. Wonderful. So I will, yeah, I'll share the slide. Can I just walk this around or? Okay. Awesome. So I will kind of carry this around and show you all. So this is basically just a slideshow of a lot of things I was talking about and kind of highlight some of the things that we can find. Again, a lot of this was found in just somebody's backyard, or you never know where this is going to be expected. So the first ones are some of my metal detecting finds. After we finish off here, anybody's welcome to look at any of the ones I brought with me here today and ask anything you want. So the first one, this is my oldest coin to date. It's a William III British halfpenny from 1699 to 1701. This was found at a tavern site in Danby, which predates, of course, any European settlement in the state of Vermont by about 50 years. I don't know how I go through. There we go. Is that it? No. Do you know how I slide through them on the iPad? Apologies. Is it on your device that it's showing?
They're not seeing this.
Oh, okay. Okay. Okay, yeah, so if we could, yeah, please, thank you. Okay, cool. So yeah, this is another thing. This was found in Middletown Springs, Vermont. It's a Vermont Light Infantry militia button from the 1830s, a very rare button. And this would have been worn by a local, probably somebody 18, 17 years old who is in the militia, and is a really great local piece of Vermont history and something that, again, was just sitting in someone's yard. So next slide, thank you. This is probably one of my coolest finds to date. I recently got this at a Revolutionary War battle site with my friend Soren. He actually found a 10-pound British, or a 9-pound cannonball at the site, which I have to admit I'm a bit jealous about. But this is a 17th Regiment American Revolutionary War Grand Army button. So this would have been worn by a Revolutionary War soldier. They're extremely rare and they originate from Boston. And to find something like this in the ground, as you can see, it's not in the greatest shape, but it is really amazing. So yeah. So just another kind of interesting thing that you can find a lot of these, again, similar to what you'll see in a museum like this with displays. This is stuff that you can actually get yourself, and it's all around us. So this is a, so a lot of them I have with me today. Almost everything on that table is going to be donated to local historical societies for the towns that they've been found in. Most of my finds are already in those historical societies, but during COVID, I wasn't able to get the newer ones in. So I donate pretty much everything I find, again, because having it in my room and appreciating it is just me. I'd rather let other people learn from it as well. So this is King Charles III Spanish half real from 1780, small silver coin. Next slide, please. Thank you. So going into what I was talking about with the George Washington inaugural buttons, as I said, I had 4, and I actually have 3 different varieties. I made about, I want to say 36 main varieties, each of which are extremely rare. This is something you'll see on display in the Smithsonian, Mount Vernon. They're really, really rare. So I have 4 of them. My first one, unfortunately, wasn't in the greatest shape, but it's incredible to see how it's found. And again, reminds you, you never know where this stuff's going to be found. So I actually found this. My father was going to an old bookstore in upstate New York. This was from like 1880. I'd gone digging there. I got permission from the owner to one small little yard by the highway. Didn't find anything, so I gave up. About a year later, I was like, 30 minutes, why not try again? And I found this right on the side of the road. And again, it predates the house by 100 years, and no way of knowing that that was going to be there. So it's you can read, it says, "Long live the president," and George Washington inscript in the center. So that's the first one I found. And then, yes, thank you. And then this is the second and third one I found, actually in the same field, a field that Ethan Allen camped in on his way to take Fort Ticonderoga in 1775. And these are 2 different ones. That one's in 2 pieces and smashed. This one, again, another variety. This is called the Link States. It has the initials of the 13 colonies linked together as a chain, and George Washington, long live the president. So I got 2 of them a week apart in that field, which came to 3, and this was 2 years ago. And And then this is the last one. I got this one about a month ago, actually at that Revolutionary War site. Again, this is post-war, but at a cabin site. And I was with my friend Soren, and it was a complete joke. I got a button, I saw it on the back, and I joked that this is what it was going to be. Didn't really believe it, and he picked it up and he cleaned it. And he said it was. And I was like, "There's no way," and it was. So I was kind of jumping up and getting down, and then he got his cannonball. So, so those are those four. And again, I have them with me today. You can all hold them and look at them. And I definitely, I only have a few weeks before I leave, but I'm always interested in seeing what I can find. And yeah, anybody, I would love to. Oh yeah, I got a bunch of cards also for anybody who wants to reach out. I also, after this, if anybody's interested, I might be doing a tour at the cemeteries for anybody who wants to see it, and I would be happy. You're all welcome. So we can do that, and then I'll just finish through these. This is actually a really amazing coin. Again, never knowing where you're going to find this. I actually found this at your property. This is a 1783 Nova Constellatio cent, considered to be the first coin ever minted for the United States. It's actually minted in England, but prior, the U.S. didn't get its mint until 1792. So we had a few different coins. We had states that minted their own currencies, and then this is the first kind of federal coin that was made for the United States. And it reads Nova Constellatio in Latin, has the starburst with the 13 stars, and then on the other side, the worst side, it says U.S. in script, which is one of the first times you see U.S. kind of inscribed. And again, this is 1783, the year the war ends, and that we really gain our independence in that sense. And this was found in the yard of a home built in the early 1900s. Last signal, I found a bunch of really cool things there. And my last signal of the day, I find this just sitting in the yard in Poultney, right down the road from where the synagogue was. So yeah, more thing. And then this is a picture of that first house in Rupert, the 1770 house, the one that I first tried to restore, kind of my entry into the world of restoration at 14. And then again, this is a picture before it was totally falling apart. This is about 10 years old. And then, yes, thank you. And then this is the house in Wallingford that was built by the son of a Rev War soldier from 1783. And unfortunately, it's now in much worse shape than what you're seeing here as well. So again, it just highlights though that these projects, now that I have this foundation of having done the cemetery and raised 19,000, what's 100? So we'll we can definitely do it. And then these are pictures from the original Poultney Pinchas, which is currently on the in the archives of, I want to say, Hebrew University in New York. I could be wrong on the name. What? This is the Pinchas, the book, the minutes book for the Jewish community of Poultney that has all the foundation. This is 1867 to 1891, and it talks about, it's in New York, in archives for, I want to say it's Hebrew University, but that might be the wrong name. But yeah, so they have the original book, and it's I have prints of the pages. So this is the first page that actually talks about the organization, the founding of this community, which again, the oldest record of such a thing in the state of Vermont. And it was recovered at a bookstore in Denver, Colorado. How it made its way there, its own story. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And then when either the Erie Canal or whatever
Mm-hmm.
opened, those people left.
Mm-hmm.
And then the people who came later were not really connected at all to that earlier group. Is that part of the story?
Yeah, so that's one of the interesting things. We know that in terms of being connected, that this book, again, because it traces from that period, that they definitely still had ties with the first kind of Jewish settlers and then the later ones. How strong those were, not as clear, especially because as you see, a lot of the later ones come to places like Granville rather than Poultney. But the cemetery was still being used in operation. And this book actually has 3 different scribes who write, so you can look at the handwriting based on periods. But most, as you say, a lot of the earlier families either left, and the records of the people who came before them are who was basically passed away and is buried in the cemetery. But you definitely we have records of Jews in Vermont dating all the way to the early 1800s and maybe even late 17, but no formal community of any kind until this, as far as is recorded. So that's the first page, and it has the founding members. And then the second page here has, which is really cool, and Professor Shine did a whole analysis of this, is that you actually see, I think, 4 different languages being used, which really shows kind of these immigrants coming and how they interacted with the culture, and it changes as they go on. So you see Hebrew being used, Yiddish, which is Hebrew German, German, and then a different variation, I think, of German as well. And so throughout the text here on one page in one sentence, you might see like 4 different languages being used in a single line, and how they kind of threw in a lot of them are grammatically incorrect, both the English and the Hebrew and everything else. And it's really interesting to see kind of how they wrote things, talking about the holidays and the observances and recording when they met at synagogue and what they did, and who performed what when they bought these different, the shofar and the Torah scrolls and everything else. So I love that page. And then the last one, I think, if we could, oh, thank you. It's not working. Oh, okay. Well, there's a 3rd page that's basically actually says exactly when in 1873 they bought the cemetery. I have that with me. I can read that in the German in the translation. And then I just had a bunch of pictures of the cemetery before and after the restoration, and of the project itself. So anything else like that, if you guys want to see on the GoFundMe, I do updates, and there's dozens of pictures as well as videos that record the whole project all the way back from last year and the evolution of it, which is really cool to see. Yeah. So I just graduated from Burn Academy in Manchester, Vermont, and I will be starting at Yale University in 4 weeks, so in a month. Prospective major is U.S. history with a minor in, thank you. Back around, okay. Yeah, so I just go all the way around. Okay, messing this up. So yeah, that's kind of my plan, and I'm interested, again, history, philosophy, theology, all of this tied together. But I really like kind of interdisciplinary, seeing all of it in relation to one another. So yeah, thank you all so much again for coming. As I said before, you are all more than welcome to look at any of these finds, and all of them, as I said, have their own histories. I'm happy to answer any other questions and talk with all of you. And then the tour, depending on when this kind of closes out, is whenever you guys want to do it. So thank you all so much for coming, both virtually and in person. I really hope this was of interest and that you don't regret spending the last hour here with me. Thank you.